Welcome to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy, where we explore the scriptural and theological case for plural marriage. I have failed to say in the last several episodes, which I always say, please engage with this podcast from the beginning. The really important topics are in those first episodes, and we really work hard to establish a framework to help everyone understand where we are now and the discussions we're having. Of course, I think all of the topics are worthwhile, and feel free to jump around. But if you really want to understand what I'm about and the purpose of this podcast, you really need to get caught up from the beginning. So also, I want to again thank those who donate to support this podcast. It means so much to me and I appreciate it. And I would like to invite and request anybody else who feels inclined to please also contribute and help out. That would be great. This is episode 73, which is going to take a surprising look at some of the evidence of polygamy, some of the vanishing evidence of polygamy, and how that has or has not affected the standard narrative and our certainty in that standard narrative. And I think ChatGPT has some very interesting things to teach us along these lines. So I'm so glad you're joining us. Thank you for being here as we take this deep dive into the murky waters of Mormon polygamy. So this has been another interesting week. This actually was not the planned topic for this week's episode. I had my interview scheduled with Jeremy Hoop to come and do his presentation on William Clayton and the other things he's been studying. And that was what we were supposed to release this week. But I have to tell you, he has been researching so much and learning so much. And as happens in these topics, the more you learn, the more you realize there is you have to look for. So he called and postponed that interview, which on the one hand, I'm so disappointed because I really want that information, but on the other hand, I'm so excited. We are probably going to extend it into more than one episode just on William Clayton because there is so much very important information there that all of us need to understand. So Jeremy's not here today, but he will be here soon. And I also have talked about what I've been working on as he's been doing that. I've been working on my research on the origin of the temple and on doing that episode that I'm very excited about. But sadly, when he canceled, I didn't have time to get the temple stuff ready for this week. It was supposed to be the week after. So instead, I thought I would just share this kind of lighthearted topic that I'd been studying. I've been experimenting with ChatGPT, and I'll get into that. And I learned some things. I was like, oh, I'll talk about that. But of course, as I started to prepare and research, that grew and grew and grew. So it's turned into actually a pretty legit episode that I hope you appreciate. It's funny that I wasn't even going to talk about most of these things necessarily. I'm sure they'd come up at some point, but it's become so par for the course that I didn't even think of doing an episode on these things as I've been learning them and studying them. So we are going to dig into this now. So for those who don't understand what ChatGPT is, I'll explain it a little bit more later on. I've kind of prepared to be able to. My mom, who's almost 90, listens to this podcast. She's wonderful, and I'm like, how can I explain it in a way that she can understand? So for now, I'll just say it's AI, artificial intelligence, right? And I've been so swamped with research. I was telling some of my friends, I need other researchers. We need 3 of ourselves so I can be studying everything. I'm really jealous of other people in this field who are able to hire researchers, and I'm not able to do that. So I'm always swamped with all of the things I need to study and learn and find and sources I need to get. And anyway, so I have been listening a lot to talk about AI, right? It's on podcasts that I listen to, and it's all around. And someone said, what was the quote that I really liked? They said, it's not AI that's going to take your job. It's somebody using AI that's going to take your job. And I was like, okay, that's true. And also, as I've been struggling, wishing I had research assistants, I thought, okay, could ChatGPT be my solution? Could I use ChatGPT to multiply myself and to give me a artificially intelligent research assistant? So that's what I started experimenting with. I am, embarrassingly non-techie. So I was like, okay, if I can do this, anybody can. So I went for it and gave it a try. And what I learned has been really, really interesting. So I'm going to, that was what I was going to talk about is my experience with ChatGPT and what I learned and discovered. But I decided instead I'm going to step back a few steps and set the stage for some of the reasons I started using ChatGPT and some of the information that I think is useful and interesting. So I always have, I mean, it's embarrassing at this point. I have like hundreds of tabs open on my computer with different screens and different files. It just gets out of control. But I was looking up something. I was, you study one thing that leads to another, that leads to another, and there are 50 things you're studying at a time. But I was in William Clayton's journals, not the new ones, just the journals you can access online. I will put a link below of the archive of a compilation of William Clayton's journals and other writings that I like to use. Anyway, I was reading in his journals and my eyes were drawn to the entry about Flora Ann Woodworth. And so Flora Ann Woodworth is a rather important wife. She's included in every list of wives that I've ever seen. She was 16 at the time of her marriage to Joseph Smith. Understand, I'm saying her hypothetical marriage. I don't believe Joseph was a polygamist anymore after my research, some of which I'm going to share with you, but I'm just going to tell it from the perspective of the narratives that we are supposed to accept. So anyway, and we learned quite a bit about Joseph's supposed polygamy from her story. So where her story comes from, there are several later reminiscences that talk about her. Well, there are a couple of different sources. I'll first talk about some of the later reminiscences because I found them interesting, and these are some of the tabs I've had open, right? So Orange White spelled Wight, he's the son of Lyman White. He wrote a testimony, an affidavit, in 1903, by request of church historians. The church historians were just seeking everywhere, trying to get people to talk about Joseph's polygamy. They were really working hard to prove this and to catalog it, right? And so Andrew Jensen was one that did a lot. I believe I'm getting his name right, but there were several of them. So most of these later reminiscences are in response to people actively seeking them and hunting people down, chasing them down, trying to get them to make claims. So Orange White, I believe, was living in Nevada at the time of this, but he wrote a long autobiography, and I'm going to read part of it. Of course, this will be linked below as well. He says, and he's 80 years old at the time. I now come to that part of my story that you will most likely be interested in, which regards the doctrine taught by the prophet Joseph Smith in regard to the plural marriage system. At first, the doctrine was taught in private. The first I knew about it was in John Higby's family. He lived close to us, and being well acquainted with him and his family, I discovered he had 2 wives. Keep that in mind, the Higbys, right? We'll go into that at another time, not right now. But then I'll go on. The next I noticed, when in company with the young folks, the girls were calling one another spirituals. Okay, so the girls were referring to each other as spirituals. She's a spiritual. Keep that in mind as well. Now, the reason why the folks was in advance of me, why they knew about plural marriage before he did, my work was in the machine shop 22 miles above Nauvoo, where I spent nearly all my time. But when at Nauvoo in the winter of 41 and 42, I became fully initiated. Okay, he would have been barely 17 at the time. So a couple of things. That's when he became fully initiated into polygamy, which he claims Joseph Smith taught, although he learned about it first in secret and in private and from hearing people refer to each other as spirituals. He's 17 now. A couple of things to remember. Polygamy was so secret that people couldn't, other than William Clayton, bizarrely, people couldn't even write about it in their private journals or their private family Bibles, or like these sources that nobody would ever look at because nobody was looking for information on it, right? They couldn't write anything about it. And yet this 17-year-old kid knows about it because people are talking about it openly, and it's being spread to him by his neighbors who are living openly with 2 wives. So this man, John Higby, had 2 wives before Joseph Smith even did. So anyway, we'll continue. Also, I do also want to point out that he was 17, and apparently Joseph Smith was teaching him about it. Although Joseph Smith's 11-year-old son, his son was 11 when he died, didn't know anything about it. Joseph apparently didn't care to pass on these extremely sacred, highest necessary doctrines to his own son, who was, by all accounts, everyone expected to be his successor. He didn't bother to tell him, but he told the 17-year-old orange white. So, okay, we'll continue on. Let's see. Oh, the last thing, sorry, I did have a couple of notes. And remember that we have a huge difference between the spiritual wifery John Higbee and others were doing and Joseph Smith's celestial plural marriage. So I guess someone forgot to tell all the girls that were calling themselves spirituals, apparently, and forgot to tell Orange White that there was a difference. Again, I'm still waiting for anyone to show me where Joseph Smith ever differentiated or ever used the term celestial plural marriage. But also, I believe it was an Emily Partridge who said it was called spiritual at the time, and she had a spiritual child. They were all, so, we'll continue. Everyone needs to decide for themselves what this Orange White, what to do with this testimony of his, whether it's evidence of what I happen to believe it could very well be evidence of, that there was indeed this false spiritual wife, plural wife doctrine being passed around without Joseph's approval, being attributed to him by people like the Higbees and others, right? If it's evidence of that, or if it's evidence for just flat out lying, which I think also happened, or if it is truly evidence that Joseph Smith was teaching this thing to a 17-year-old kid in 41 and 42, and that it was just in the milieu and everybody do it. Those are our choices, right? We each have to make our own decision. So let's continue finally with the testimony. At this time, I was ordained an elder. He talks about going on a mission. In the spring of 43, I went back to Nauvoo. I was on this mission 13 months. Now, although in my 20th year, so he's 19 now after his mission, I would not be 20 until the 29th of November, 1843, I concluded to look about and try to pick up one or more of the young ladies before they were all gone. So now he's a 19-year-old, and also he was initiated into this before he'd even been a missionary as a 17-year-old kid, right? And now he's going to go get his wives. So I commenced keeping company with Flora Woodworth, daughter of Lucian Woodworth, the pagan prophet. Lucian, I don't know how people say that. I was walking along the street with Flora near the prophet's residence when he, Joseph, drove up in his carriage, stopped and spoke to I and Flora, and asked us to get in his carriage and ride up with him. So they're basically courting at this point, right? Orange and Flora. And they're walking down the street. The prophet picks them up. He opened the door for us, and when we were seated opposite to him, he told the driver to drive on. We went to the Nauvoo temple lot and many other places during the afternoon, and then he drove to the Woodworth house, and we got out and went in. After we had got in the house, Sister Woodworth took me in another room and told me that Flora was one of Joseph's wives. I was aware, so this is one of the evidences that Flora is married to Joseph Smith, is that Orange White, in 1903, as an 80-year-old man, claims that he was dating Flora, but Flora's mom had to inform him that she was already taken because she was a secret wife of the prophet. So he continues, I was aware or believed that Eliza R. Snow and the two Partridge girls were his wives. So again, pretty common knowledge if that's true, right? But not informed about Flora. I mean, you have to realize how human brains work. By 1903, he knew all of this, right? So it's very easy to project back and either think he knew it then or claim he knew it then or just not. It's like anachronisms, right? You can't, it's hard to get back to the mindset you were in back at that time period and tell a good story, to be accurate. So he continues, but now Sister Woodworth gave me all the information necessary. So I knew Joseph believed and practiced polygamy. So he knew Joseph believed and practiced. He already claimed that Joseph was teaching it, but now he already knew that Joseph was married to Eliza and the Partridge sisters, but it was Sister Woodworth telling him about Flora that made him know. That's how I learned that Joseph was doing this. It just gets more and more fun. And so he continues, now, as a matter of course, I at once, after giving Flora a mild lecture, left her and looked for a companion in other places where I could be more sure. So he had to give Flora a piece of his mind for being unfaithful to the prophet and leading him on. And then he shares his exploits in courting 3 girls at the same time and managing to marry 2 of them and the third later. And it implies that he married them during Joseph's life because he says that's part of his evidence as well. He claims that he was taught this by the apostles. Oh, but also Joseph Smith. And if you look up on his marriage dates that we have, he married one of his wives in 44 and the other one's after the prophet's death. So you can make of it what you will. That's one of our evidences for for Joseph's polygamy in general and his marriage to Flora Woodworth. So again, I recommend reading through this affidavit and seeing what you think of it, what sense you get from it, and seeing what you point out that are inaccuracies or problems. So, okay, another one is Helen Mar Kimball. She was another teenage wife of the prophet, right? Helen Mar was 14 when they got married, and Flora Woodworth was 16. So they were two of his youngest wives. And she was asked repeatedly as well to write her history, and she was asked repeatedly about Flora Woodworth by Andrew Jensen. And so I again will put one of her reports below. So this is what she says. On the evening of September 1st, Brother Woodworth and family arrived, all sick. I believe she's talking about in winter quarters or far west, something like that. I want to say it's 1846. I looked up the year this would have been happening. So it was 1846. So they encamped outside of the square. A little distant from our tent. We had a temporary bedstead prepared and took their daughter, Flora Gove, into our tent. Gove, G-O-V-E. Family search and her wedding certificate lists her as Flora Grove, so it's confusing, but it's G-O-V-E. So I'll say Gove and hope that's what it is. Into our tent, where I nursed her until she recovered her strength. Her husband was also sick with fever. She lay helpless for many days, and her heavy raven locks were so matted together that it took me hours to comb them out. We had lived neighbors in Nauvoo and were old schoolmates. She was older than myself and was sealed to the prophet as his wife. So there's another evidence. This happened before I was aware of the principle. So that's funny because we don't have an exact agreed upon date for Flora's sealing to Joseph Smith. Some say it was May 1st of 43. Some say it was March 4th of 43. The official sources just say the spring of 43. It's funny because Helen Mar's sealing date to the prophet was May 3rd of 43. So I don't know how she's claiming that Flora was sealed to her before she knew anything about it. Because if you read Helen's account of the time it took to teach her about this, she would have been very well aware of it by the spring of 43, which is the same time she was apparently married to Joseph. So we'll continue. A young man boarding at her father's house after the death of Joseph, not a member of the church, had sought her hand and in time won her heart. And in a reckless moment, she was induced to accept his offer, and they eloped to Carthage. Okay, so that is Carlos Gove that she's talking about right there, Flora's husband. And in her testimony, Flora was married to Joseph before she knew anything about it, but after Joseph died, she fell in love with and foolishly married a non-member. So let's see, they eloped to Carthage accompanied by a young lady friend, and they were married by a justice of the peace. Flora was never happy with him as he hated the Mormons. Again, I haven't found any other report that he hated the Mormons, and he went with them, right? If he hated the Mormons, why would he go on their journeys with them, stay with them? And she felt condemned for the rash steps she had taken. She made this confession to me while I was nursing her, and said she desired to cling to Joseph thereafter. They settled on the Point, and she paid me a visit the following winter. So, they settled at the Point, which must be a location. She still expressed herself as strong in the faith of the gospel, also her great desire to cleave to the prophet. I never saw her again, as she died in that place, leaving 2 or 3 children. So the only another source I found, Find a Grave, that's, I believe, probably more reliable, says that she only has 1 child, Charles Gove, but I don't know which it is. Helen continues, I have given this little incident in the life of Flora truthfully, and it ought to teach a lesson to those who read it. For no Latter-day Saint can find happiness in marriage with an unbeliever. As soon as the illusion which bewilders them wears off, they find no true companionship, and remorse will come, though, alas, too late to retrace their steps. So there's her little moral tale at the sake of Flora, who after Joseph's death, she foolishly married a non-member, but pined for Joseph the rest of her days and ended up basically dying with a broken heart because she was married to a non-member, right? That's Helen's reminiscence about Flora Woodworth's marriage to Joseph. Again, both of those were sought, were desired, it sounds like some of the people were kind of hounded into making reports. That's the impression I get. Of course, that's my assumption from reading through these. So we'll go, Todd Compton also, of course, course, includes Flora. He says that Flora must have been one of Joseph's favorites, that Joseph must have been very attached to her, because no other wife is given the kind of prominence and attention in Clayton's journal that Flora is given. So that's when we come to, and he also tells that in late 1844, a young non-member, Carlos Gove, began to spend time with her, and he goes on from there. So he has a lot of things to say about Flora based on this narrative we're given, right? In large part from Helen Mar Kimball and Clayton's journal. So now we'll get back to where I started. This is William Clayton's journal. So not Joseph's journal, William Clayton's journal, which is one of the very problematic sources. I think that when we do our episodes on Clayton, when I do those with Jeremy Hoop, we will talk a lot about these journals for anyone who doesn't understand them and explain what they are, why they matter so much, and what the strange, complicated history of them is. But to be really brief, the church, there have been some sort of leaked portions of them. I believe I've read we have 20 to 30% based on some people's who have seen them. That's how much we have access to that was sort of leaked out. But we don't know for sure. They have not been released. In 2017, the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and the church announced that they would be released through the Joseph Smith Papers Project. They still have not been released 5 full years later. And recently a meeting was held that they said they don't expect to release them anytime in the next several years. They wouldn't give a date. And I've heard through other channels, nothing I can verify, but I've heard that they've been kind of shut down. We shouldn't expect them to come forward. So who knows? That's all we know, is that they were promised in 2017. The official word is they're not happening for the next several years. No idea when, but basically don't hold your breath. So that's the situation. So all we have are these leaked portions that we can read through, and we'll get into more explanation about that. So I will, as I said, link below an archive.org introduction an account where you can read his journals and many of the other things. And keep in mind, it's so illogical because William Clayton was an official assistant to Joseph Smith. So if anyone's writings would be suspect or called into court to verify something, they would be his. And he was writing like crazy about polygamy, but no one else wrote anything about it because it was so dangerous. These are some of the problems I find in this narrative. And so, okay, this is his entry for May 1st, 1843. AM at the temple. At 10, married Joseph to Lucy Walker. PM at President Joseph's. He has gone out with Woodworth. So he got married that morning to one girl and went on basically a date that evening with another girl, right, with Flora Woodworth. And then this is from his, I had to track this down because it's kind of hard, but I was able to find it was printed in the Deseret News, May 20th, 1886, under the title Celestial Marriage. It was also included, this is a testimony that William Clayton gave. It was also included in a book written by Kate B. Carter. She was the, I could not figure out who this was or what this book was. She was the president of the Daughters of the Mormon Pioneers. I think that's what it's called. She was the president of that for decades, and she wrote a 12-volume compilation of polygamous marriages, and she called it Heartthrobs of the West. Okay, that's what threw me for a loop. Heartthrobs of the West. I mean, it's clever, but kind of so gross. Anyway, so she recorded it in that as well. So it's one of those sources that's been used. This is what he said. On the first day of May 1843, I officiated in the office of an elder marrying Lucy Walker to the prophet Joseph Smith at his own residence. During this period, the prophet took several other wives. Amongst the number I well remember Eliza Partridge, Emily Partridge, Sarah Ann Whitney, Helen Kimball, and Flora Woodworth. These all, he acknowledged to me, were his lawful wedded wives, according to the celestial order. His wife Emma was cognizant of the fact of some, if not all, of these being his wives, and she generally treated them very kindly. So that's his report given in 1886, right? Again, way after the fact and just lumping all of these wives in together. That's why some people say that it was May 1st, and there apparently in his journal is Woodworth written and then scratched out so it's barely legible on March 4th. I can't see that in the copy I have because I don't have access to the actual pictures of the journal. But that's why some people say March 4th is the wedding date. This is the kind of information that we are going on to make these claims, right? Then May 2nd, talked with Jane Charnock. She loves me and would sooner unite to me than are. I have to tell you, reading through this, his exploits, his talking incessantly about plural marriage and the women he's trying to get, and the like going to bed together with 2 women at a time, and who's angry and who loves him and it's insane. Like, read his journal. It's insane. So what we have of it so far. So anyway, he combines his love exploits with Joseph's. After that, he says, Joseph rode out today with Flora W. 23rd of August, 1843, Wednesday, Nauvoo. Wednesday, let's see. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit confused. So, I think we're skipping from May up till August. So this is Wednesday, August 23rd of 1843. President J told me that he had difficulty with E yesterday. That's Emma. She rode up to Woodworth's with him and called while he came to the temple. When he returned, she was demanding the gold watch of Flora. He reproved her for her evil treatment. So remember that. I'm going to talk a lot about about watches, right? So the story is, according to Clayton, this is the only source for this, that Emma stopped at the Woodworths and is yelling at Flora and demanding she give back the gold watch that Joseph had given her as a wedding present. Something like that. That's what it's supposed to be. When he returned, she was demanding the gold watch of Flora. He reproved her for her evil treatment. On their return home, she abused him much. And also when they got home, he had to use harsh measures to put a stop to her abuse, but finally succeeded. So again, it's always also surprising, was William Clayton there, right? How is he supporting this? I mean, how is he reporting this? Joseph didn't say anything about this. What we are being told here is it's another story of Emma being just completely out of control, screaming hysterically at Joseph, so he basically had to abuse her to get her to stop. That's the story we get from this entry in William Clayton's, right? So it's open to interpretation. That's how it sounds to me. He had to use harsh measures but to stop her abuse, but finally succeeded. You guys can all determine what that means. It doesn't sound good to me. It doesn't sound like any other reports we get about Joseph and Emma, especially from the children living in their home who would know about their relationship, right? This evening I had some more then he continues. So that was the part about Flora and Emma and Joseph and watches. Then he continues, this evening I had some more conversation with Margaret and find she is stubborn and disposed to abuse me. I won't. He goes on about Margaret, on and on and on. It's so awful reading what he is recording. You guys have to see if you think that it comes across as like valid. I guess the problem is who I think William Clayton is who other people assume Joseph Smith is based on William Clayton's claims. So I guess that's the mindset they're in. That is not how it reads to me, because William Clayton is very different from Joseph Smith, the words we get from them. And anyway, so back to the journal, we then have Saturday, August 26th. Hiram and I rode up to my house, and Joseph, met Mrs. Woodworth and Flora, and conversed for some time. President J and I walked from my house to Sister Durfee's and thence to his house. Then Monday 28th, President J met Ms. Woodworth at my house. The 29th, a.m. at the temple, President J met at my house with Miss Woodworth. So we have the 26th, he's meeting with Flora and her mother for at least part of the time. The 28th and the 29th, Joseph is at Clayton's house alone with Flora, right? So this is the narrative that we have. They're married in August, they're married in May, spring, and then in August they have all of these interactions that are recorded in this journal, right? Starting with Emma screaming at Flora, screaming at Joseph, and then these secret encounters later on, or private encounters. So it's interesting because there is sharp disagreement about what these mean. Keep in mind, this is the only evidence we have of anything to do with Flora, right? Is William Clayton's journal, then these later reminiscences. That's what we're building this on. And so William Clayton's journal is really the linchpin for it. And D. Michael Quinn argues very sharply that these are sexual encounters. Joseph is alone with Flora in someone else's house. So he has other evidence for that as well. Brian Hales argues very strongly these are not sexual encounters, and we'll get into why that is. But so there's a lot of disagreement. So this has been the narrative about Flora, right? She married Joseph in the spring of 43. She was super special to him because there are so many recordings of her in the journal. Like Todd Compton points out, no one else is recorded as much as she is, and this is how much she's recorded. And I've read you every part, every entry that talks about Flora or her family. And well, I guess her dad is talked about, but I mean, as a plural wife, anything to do with that. And so she was beloved by Joseph Smith. Joseph died, and she was, the next several months later, foolishly married a non-member. So that's been the story we have about her. So that's what we did have until in 2015, something happened. The marriage certificate for Flora Woodworth and Carlos Charles Gove, it says Grove on the marriage certificate. They made a lot of mistakes. So in one place it says Flora Woodruff instead of Woodworth and Charles Grove, but it's recorded both on the marriage certificate and in the county records. So we can verify that it is indeed the marriage certificate for this very Flora Woodworth and this very Charles Gove. And you will notice the date. It is August 23rd, 1843. Not 1844, which would be only a few months after Joseph's death, which is interesting because of the letter where Joseph said that, no, they do not believe that a man should have more than one wife unless his wife has died. But even then, they disapprove of the practice of getting married a few weeks or even a few months later, that they should wait for a longer time than that. But nevertheless, this story that we had of Flora marrying Carlos a few months after Joseph's death got blown to smithereens by finding a piece of actual historical evidence, right? And so this is really interesting. It should really make us stop and think and question the credibility. In my opinion, we should really question the credibility of Clayton and of Helen Mar Kimball and of Orange White, as if, do we really need more help to question more more clues that we should question their credibility? But this should be a big one, right? Also, this is where we get that narrative of the crazy Emma, right? Like all of these things should be called into question, because the fact is, all of these dates that William Clayton is talking about in his journal with Joseph and Emma, Joseph and Flora, he doesn't bother to include the rather important fact that Flora got married to another man, got legally married. So it's interesting because when you read, in fairness, Todd Compton and other writers wrote their books before the marriage certificate was discovered, so we can't hold them accountable to that. But I am curious that nobody has considered removing Flora from the list of wives. That doesn't seem to be happening at all. We're just told that her story needs to be told a little differently or reimagined, right? And Brian Hales to the rescue. He's able to take this new data and unflinchingly, no one seems to flinch on the narrative. They just need to kind of massage and work the new data into the current narrative without ever questioning the narrative. So this is what we get now. Now that we know that Flora married Carlos while Joseph Smith was very much alive and while all of these entries were taking place. So the story that we have now, according to Brian Hales, is, so Emma abused Flora on the 22nd. She was so upset that the very next day she ran out and got married, to that groom she just had in her back pocket in case of such a marriage emergency, I guess. But, we already know from Orange's testimony that she got around. She's a little bit slutty. So we shouldn't be surprised that it's in her character, right? So this is the new story. So then right after she got married on the 26th, 28th, and 29th, when Joseph was meeting with her and her mother or with her alone, it became, let's see, I'll read to you. I pulled some of the quote out. Those visits that used to be absolute evidence of sexuality in this marriage, right? This is when they changed. And they now, quote, were undoubtedly held to deal with the future of Flora's sealing to the prophet, as well as to consider the theological consequences of her rash decision to marry Gove. So that's what they were about. They were just trying to figure out what this means for Flora. She should technically be on her honeymoon. Who knows where Carlos Gove is while Joseph is meeting secretly one-on-one with Flora at Clayton's house. I mean, maybe it still was sexual. Maybe this, the whole thing, but undoubtedly this is what it means. So that's what I find so fascinating. This polygamy narrative, it's like a black hole, and it just, any new massive thing that is discovered, it just absorbs it and just doesn't change at all, right? It just takes that new information, sucks it in, and it keeps going on. So I find that to be really interesting, right? It's not a stretch at all. We have these very reliable sources that nobody seems to look at critically. The fact that that Helen said that it was the next year that they got married, that it was after Joseph's death, or that Orange White is talking about spirituals and that he was taught the doctrine by Joseph Smith while he was 17, and all of the internal contradictions there, or that Clayton is making all of these records, doesn't bother to include the fact that Flora got married. So no, there's no problem to any of this. We know what we know. Joseph was a polygamist. Joseph married Flora, and all we have to do is reimagine the scenario to fit in the new evidence. Never question the narrative, right? So okay, that's what I see. It just keeps happening again and again, that things dissolve. Things that you look like evidence all of a sudden are really strange, really ridiculous. And it seems to me that this kind of thing keeps happening. So our certainty of Joseph's polygamy seems to me to outstrip the available evidence to prove that. So let's do another example. This I planned to do an entire episode on this at some point, on Joseph's children, his polygamous children, but we're just going to talk about this one example here because it's the best one. So there were several claims of Joseph's children, but the strongest claim by far, at least from everything I've seen, of Joseph's polygamy was Sylvia Sessions Lyon, right? And then Josephine Lyon. She was the strongest case for Joseph's polygamy. That, well, I shouldn't overstate it. I heard her used many times as sort of like the smoking gun. Like, of course, Joseph was a polygamist. There's Josephine Lyon. And many researchers just knew that she was Joseph's child. Historians, that was, according to what I have seen, pretty much the standard narrative. And it was interesting because throughout most of the 20th century, the 1900s, the church didn't talk about Joseph's polygamy, right? It was kind of under wraps till it started coming out later with D. Michael Quinn and others. It started to be talked about by researchers, and the researchers at that point, from what I have seen, pretty much generally accepted that Josephine Lyon was Joseph's child. So someone can correct me if I'm wrong. So let's get into this story. It's, again, really interesting. There are some interesting similarities between the story of Flora Woodworth, Phoebe is her mother, and Sylvia Lyon. So that's Josephine's mother. So first of all, they are two of the mother-daughter pairs of wives. Well, Patty Sessions and Sylvia Sessions Lyon are mother and daughter who both claim to have been sealed to Joseph. I'll link to the claims that we make about them. And interestingly, Phoebe Woodworth was sealed to Joseph Smith. And so they are considered by some people another mother-daughter pair. Phoebe was sealed to Joseph Smith after Joseph's death, and it's kind of interesting as well because her husband was still alive, very active in the church, but she was sealed to him for time and to Joseph Smith for eternity, whatever that means. So anyway, we have these two mother-daughter pairs, and a couple of other things that are really interesting is they all were married, right? Flora got married, supposedly, married Joseph first before she got married. The other three were already married, as far as I can see, to husbands who were members and active in the church. So that's another interesting thing. These all were polyandrous marriages and with mothers and daughters. So very fascinating. There are multiple records of statements made by early church members talking about Josephine as Joseph's child. There's a woman living in Bountiful, the name Josephine. She's Joseph's daughter. And so it was, that was the belief at the time. And so again, the researchers, the church historians, got Josephine to make a statement. And so I think that those other claims probably stem from this same place we'll see. So this was written by Josephine R. Fisher, so Josephine Lyon Fisher is her name, in Bountiful, Utah, February 24th, 1914. This is her statement. Just prior to my mother's death in 1882, she called me to the bedside and told me that her days on earth were about numbered, and before she passed away from mortality, she desired to tell me something which she had kept as an entire secret from me and from others, but which she now desired to communicate to me. She then told me that I was the daughter of the prophet Joseph Smith, she having been sealed to the prophet at the time that her husband, Mr. Lyon, was out of fellowship with the church. She also told me that she was sealed to the prophet about the same time that Zina D. Huntington and Eliza R. Snow were thus sealed. In conclusion, Mother told me not to make her statement to me too public, as it might cause trouble and arouse unpleasant curiosity. I have followed her advice, and I am relating the facts today practically the first time, responding to the request or desire of one of the assistant church historians. So signed in the presence of, among others, Andrew Jensen, by Josephine R. Fisher. Okay, that is the reason that Josephine is Joseph's child. Interesting, right? Now, if you think about this, it really is at best third hand. We have to decide, was Josephine telling the truth about what her mother told her on her deathbed? That is a valid question we need to ask, right? Was her mother, if Josephine is telling the truth, was her mother telling the truth on her deathbed? Is it remembered accurately by both of them, right? There's a lot of, this is very much third hand. This is a third hand, very late source, but we really believed. I mean, she's named Josephine. She's named after her father, right? And so from what I have seen, this was pretty much the generally accepted narrative that Josephine was Joseph's child, and therefore Joseph was a polygamist, because she really was the ultimate proof. What can you do if there's a child from a polygamous marriage? So that's what we had, and there was really not very much room to doubt. I think this is part of why nobody took the Prices seriously. They were trying to write their books, Joseph Smith Fought Polygamy, but Joseph Smith had a child. So enter Dr. Hugo Perego, a highly trained genetic and molecular biologist and a DNA researcher. And he did the genetic testing. So Josephine, as I said, wasn't the only claimed child. There were also 7 sons that were claimed to be Joseph Smith, but they were easier to do genetic testing on because they're males and they were testing the male line. I'll explain it a little bit. So they had already been ruled out or were ruled out at this point. That was a little bit more straightforward. But because Josephine was female, things were more complicated. This is what Dr. Perego said in his 2016 report about this. DNA testing used in the past and based solely on the male inherited Y chromosome could not be employed to address the question of Josephine's biological paternity. Perego went on to explain that that only recently had the necessary technology become available that was needed to determine Josephine's parentage. But now they had it, and they did the testing. And after explaining his procedure and the results, he concluded, this information strongly supports that Joseph Smith was not the biological father of Josephine Lyon, but that she was the daughter of Windsor Lyon. So that, again, an article about that will be linked below. So we officially, right, a lot of people know about this and have heard about it. I remember it was really kind of a shockwave. I remember it being talked about a lot, that Josephine Lyon was not Joseph's child, and we know that now. So again, it didn't matter. It had no effect, right? The certainty that we had about the polygamy narrative when we thought Joseph had children didn't lessen at all when we found out that not only did Joseph have children, but that this whole reporting from Sylvia and or Josephine needed to be questioned and reevaluated, right? But again, the narrative marches on without a hiccup. It just absorbs this, twists it in, and says that is absolutely certain of what it means. So let's see. The church narrative, the Brian Hales narrative, he determined that Sylvia meant, he determined that Sylvia just meant that Joseph was Josephine's spiritual or covenantal father. So it's not spiritual wifery, but Joseph is Josephine's spiritual father or father in the covenant, and that not her literal physical father, and that now we can use Sylvia's testimony to understand that there was no sex in any polyandrous marriage. So that's how Brian Hales absorbed this. The more common the more common interpretation that really took hold and remains in full force was that this only meant that Sylvia didn't know who the father was because she was having sex with both men. I do not think that is the interpretation either Sylvia or Josephine would want anyone to take from what Josephine reported that Sylvia said. She said that her husband was out of favor with the church at the time, but now we are claiming that she was having sex with both men, which does not fit in with any scriptural explanations of polygamy, right? That is universally considered to be adultery. According to even all of the polygamists agree with that. But yeah, that's what we say. I think, it's really interesting. I'm going to read a recent back and forth I had with a very, very prominent historian who wrote an award-winning biography of Joseph Smith and has written many other books. And I'm, on the one hand, I'm kind of honored that he commented on my channel. On the other hand, it was an interesting interaction, but I really appreciate that there is at least discussion. I'm hoping something good can come from that. So he said on one of my episodes, you use the no children argument, including Josephine Lyons, which you missed the whole point of. Sylvia thought Josephine was Joseph Smith's daughter because she was having sex with both men. That's the only reason for her mistake. Case closed. So I found that interesting, right? Like I responded explaining my perspective and expressing surprise at his certainty, because that is an interpretation of evidence. That's not evidence, right? And I asked if he had evidence that could support his claim that the case was closed, that his interpretation was absolutely the final word on it. And then among much other discussion that was happening, people just voiced they were shocked and appalled that I would ask this expert historian for evidence. They were like, "Are you asking so-and-so to provide evidence? Who do you think you are?" Basically. And to be fair, this historian didn't say that himself, but it was definitely the feeling that was coming across. So I responded and said, claiming that Sylvia was sleeping with both men is an assumption, not a fact and not evidence. It is nothing but an interpretation of very limited facts, and in my opinion, not the best or most likely interpretation. Saying case closed about an assumption with no additional evidence is concerning, especially coming from a respected expert in the field. There are many more precedents and much more evidence for the phenomenon of lying for the Lord, as well as overstating connections to Joseph to elevate status and well-being in the caste system of polygamous society. He did have a very valid objection to that, so I would like to discuss these things more with him. I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to. I do think there's more evidence of the lying for the Lord and trying to claim connection to Joseph than there is evidence of married women committing adultery with Joseph, which cannot be included as anything but adultery under any definition or explanation of polygamy. In addition, Sylvia's own statement does not support the interpretation that she was committing adultery by sleeping with both men. She did not say Joseph might be Josephine's father, as a woman uncertain of paternity due to having multiple partners would necessarily have to admit. She said Joseph was Josephine's father, which we know to be untrue. It was not an admission of having multiple sexual partners, even if we choose to call them husbands. It was a motivated untruth, either a lie for the Lord, which they were taught was righteous and would bring blessings, or a final gift to her daughter to raise her importance and well-being in the community, or a combination of both. There was, whatever we want to claim, there was absolutely status in being associated with Joseph Smith. And there was pressure being put on, right, to make these statements. The far more likely interpretation, both based on the actual evidence, in my opinion, is that Sylvia was not being factual in her statement. If someone, no matter how well established they are, claims and insists on an interpretation of facts that is not supported by evidence and contradicts the available evidence, then yes, they are under the obligation to provide evidence to support their assumptions. I hope this historian will do just that. And so I invited him to come on the podcast and discuss it, but he made it pretty clear. There were a lot of people who thought that was a good idea, but he made it clear that he would not condescend to that level. He said, when I choose to respond, it will be on my channel, which I can respect that. And he did say that he prefers doing things slowly and thoughtfully rather than in a live discussion. Totally respect that. And in fairness, again, this historian wrote his award-winning biography of Joseph Smith 12 years before the DNA testing was done. So I understand it can be extremely difficult to step back when you have that much invested, right? That much writing on it. It's just that seems to be the case everywhere, right? We have the certainty still based on this past evidence, while the evidence is sort of evaporating or at least needing to be reimagined, right? But it doesn't affect the certainty of the narrative. A quote that I have used several times this past couple of weeks is Upton Sinclair's brilliant quote. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it. And I would include like credibility and, eminent status or just even investment into a narrative. I think that a lot of people are trying to be honest, but when you're so invested into a narrative, it can be really hard to see that you are explaining everything to prove your narrative through the lens of already having proved your narrative. And it just doesn't work. I don't think it works. I think that we need to reinvestigate a lot of this with the additional information that we now have that has not been fairly dealt with. Like if we had all of the information that we have now and came back to this study fresh, would we potentially form different conclusions or at least be less certain in our conclusions? I think that we would. So this leads me to what was going to be the main point of this episode before I went on all of these other sidetracks. So since I added these other things, it's just going to be a final point. But actually, I'm going to go one more place first because it's another thing. It's what I started to talk to ChatGPT about, and it's the topic of watches, right? You'll remember that Flora's journal is where Clayton talks about the gold watch that Emma was demanding from Flora. And that's where I believe we get the idea of Joseph giving watches to some of his wives. I've heard that from several different places. They talk about watches being part of Joseph's polygamy. And so I was like, okay, I need to get to the bottom of this because all I know about is this journal entry, and it doesn't seem like enough to make this claim. So what else is there? So I thought I should track it down. And so that's what I only knew vaguely about Clayton's journal with Flora and then Eliza Snow's watch. That's all I know. So I thought that I should be able to find more. So here's what we know about the watches, right? We have Clayton's journal, and then in 1912, Brigham Young's nephew, Seymour Young, who was a general authority, he gave us more information about Flora's watch. The name of the prophet's plural wives included Flora, Flora Woodward, he says Woodward, to whom he is said to have given a gold locket or watch, which was stamped underfoot by Emma. So I've also heard that she stamped it and destroyed it. And this was the only source I could find for that. It was Brigham Young's nephew, who was not born at the time in 1912. And we know how, these stories about what Emma did, we know how valid those are coming across the pulpit from Brigham Young or his nephew, apparently. So I decided that we can kind of throw that one out. Sadly, this is like a quote of a quote, and it has ellipses, it has pieces missing. I'm not able to get access to it because this record is restricted. So I can only quote it from Brian Hales, who quoted it from D. Michael Quinn. I always like to find the original source. And so that was disappointing, but that's what we have. I don't know why it's restricted. So let's see. I'm going to, like I said, check the Emma destroying the watch off my list. I don't think that's valid. We can still decide about the Emma demanding the watch from Flora story that is relying only on Clayton the day before Flora got married. You can decide whether to check that off or whether to keep it. You also need to include in that the narrative of Emma being a crazy person, Joseph abusing her. And just so you know, I'm not doing this necessarily for the sake of, I have a testimony of Joseph and I need to believe he was a good man and prove he was a good man. That's not where I'm coming at this from. I'm coming at it from, all of the reports we have of all of their neighbors, everyone who ever dealt with Emma Smith in particular. Joseph as well. I've never heard of him abusing his wife other than from Brigham Young. And apparently Seymour Young, right? And that's why I think there's just not enough evidence. I mean, if someone wants to show me things I'm missing, but what I have read about Emma Smith does not paint the picture of this crazy woman. It only comes through this polygamy narrative through these very limited sources. The first of which was William Clayton. So let's see. Okay, then the other thing that ties Joseph to watches with wives is Eliza Snow. It's really the only other thing. And so there are many reports of Eliza Snow showing gold watches to people, implying that it was a gift from her husband, from a husband to wife. Like that's the picture that we always get. And so I was trying to track down these claims, and I came across this fantastic article written by Jenny Reeder when she was a graduate student. She's the one that wrote the recent book on Emma Smith, published by Deseret Book. That was one of the sources I utilized in doing that episode. And so I'm going to quote a bit from this, and I also will link it below. I think it's great. It's called Eliza Snow and the Prophet's Gold Watch, Timekeeper as Relic. So to open, she quotes from an 1885 account of a visitor to Utah, an English woman that said, Sister Smith took from her neck a chain to which was attached a large ornamented gold watch, a relic, she told us, most precious to her, it having been the property of the murdered prophet whose wife she had been. So, and she meant relic in the religious sense. It can be defined as a physical object accorded spiritual significance because of its association with a holy person. So like the Catholics have relics, right? This was a Mormon relic. And so, and a relic was not merely a symbol of the saint, but also denoted the saint's continual physical presence in the world. That's from Jenny Reeder's article. And so this was Eliza's gold watch. I'll read a little bit more. The watch was transformed into a venerated relic as Snow exhibited it throughout her travels, allowing children to hold and kiss the timepiece as a vestige or metonym of Smith years after his martyrdom. So metonym means kind of the same thing as relic, like it's not just representative of Joseph, it kind of is Joseph himself, right? It contains Joseph's spirit somehow with it. And let's see, Smith Eliza constantly used the watch to create a corporeal connection between her and Joseph Smith, both in their leadership roles and in the plural marriage. The possession and display of the watch communicated these important relationships and became imbued with reverence, emotion, and attachment. The watch became a public symbol of her personal role as one of the prophet's wives and as a proponent of the institution of plural marriage. So are you getting how Eliza used this watch? Really, it really was her literal badge of honor. It was her identity. She wore it and it carried all of this importance. It was kind of like wearing the badge of approval from Joseph Smith. It was like having Joseph Smith on her shoulder in a way, approving of everything she said and taught and did. And so, but get this. So that's the portion I've read to you so far. I'll read this verse. She wore it as a badge of identity. This is what I was saying. A crucial element in her authoritative organizational role and presidentess of all the women's organizations and universally recognized female leader of Mormon women. But this is what I missed that quote. This is what I really want us to know because I found it so interesting. She never said anything about how she got it or when he gave it to her. There are a couple of fascinating things. This is the first one. The only explanation we have, at least that I'm aware of, or that Jenny Reeder is aware of, the only explanation that we have of how Eliza got the watch came from Martha McBride Knight. And it was a recollection of the organization of the Relief Society. She said, Joseph Smith had to leave before the meeting was dismissed. So he took the watch out of his pocket and laid it on the table by Eliza R. Snow, the secretary of the meeting, and said, begin your meetings on time and end them on time. He left the watch on the table and Eliza R. Snow kept it in her possession until her death. So that's the only explanation we have of how Joseph gave the watch to Eliza, right? That that's like basically he was lending it potentially to the secretary because he had to leave the meeting early, and she just kept it. So everyone, again, is free to interpret it their own way because that's the only information that we have. So do with that what you will. But it's pretty funny to know that that's the story of how Eliza got it. And Eliza never said anything differently. She never said how she got the watch, right? So there's no contradiction we can look to, and there's no reason we know of that we should throw out Martha Knight's explanation of how she got the watch. So nonetheless, but despite this, Zina Young and Eliza Snow both repeatedly showed the watch, especially to children, establishing reverence in their minds, letting them hold, touch, kiss it as a literal sacred relic. Zina Young at least one time, if not more times, claimed it was the one the prophet was wearing when he was killed, which was absolutely not true. No, I think that was a different watch she did that with. I don't know. She would go around with watches as well and claim it was the one he was wearing. That's not true, because the watch Joseph was wearing at the time of his death was kept by his family. But useful stories grew and grew, as they tend to do, right? Just like it reminds me of John Taylor's story of his pocket watch blocking the bullet, right? Which is now readily accepted as not true. But these useful stories have a way of growing and embedding themselves, especially when there are these venerated adults talking about the sacred prophet and the sacred relic, talking to children who are then brought up knowing that and passed on to their children, right? That's how these things happen, I think. So now this is the really important thing we need to know about Eliza R. Snow. This fascinated me. She never spoke or wrote, even in her journal, anything about being married to Joseph Smith. She never claimed so she's married to Brigham Young for decades, right? But she is still referred to as Eliza R. Snow. Even when Brigham would introduce her or speak to her, he would call her either Miss Eliza or R. Snow or Miss Snow. So Miss implies single, right? Not married. And she kept her own name. She was Miss Snow, Miss Eliza R. Snow, her entire life until Emma died. So 2 days after Eliza got the news of Emma's death is the first time that she talked about the watch as being evidence of her marriage to Joseph. And I think that is fascinating. I never found her to actually declare it like she, like the quote from the Visitor to England. It's always, who was her husband? She never actually, I think that there were, in my interpretation, I think maybe some careful trying, Brian Hales talks about carefully worded denials that Joseph did. I disagree with that, but I do think that Eliza used carefully worded implications to try to get across a message without directly saying it. And so I think it's fascinating that she waited until Emma died before she talked about the watch as a symbol of her marriage. That's important, right? I mean, again, maybe it seems to me a potential pattern, just like Section 132 wasn't released until Mary Fielding Smith was on her deathbed. Maybe there's nothing to that. I don't know. But here it is happening again. 2 days after 2 days after Eliza got word of Emma's death, Eliza had a speaking engagement. And that's the first time she talked about the watch as belonging to her husband. Also, after Emma's death is when Eliza R. Snow changed her name to Eliza R. Snow Smith and became Sister Smith. You'll notice also in that recollection, she was referred to as Sister Smith. Eliza R. Snow, who was the many decades long wife of Brigham Young, at this point became Sister Smith. Now, again, patterns, I get accused, but we have the Melissa Lott Bible, where Melissa Lott Bernheisel is after the fact listed as Melissa Smith as evidence of her marriage to Joseph. It doesn't make any sense. Nobody ever called her Melissa Smith. That was never her name. No one ever called Eliza Snow Eliza Smith or Sister Smith ever. It was never her name. They didn't even call her Sister Young. Zina Young at least took Brigham's name and did have at least, I believe, one child with Brigham. Eliza didn't take Brigham's name, but while she was married to him, after Emma's death, she took Joseph Smith's name. I find that all kinds of fascinating, right? So again, everyone has to decide what to do with that. What does it mean? To me, it doesn't speak of credibility of telling the truth. It speaks of the credibility of trying to push a narrative that she felt compelled to push. So I think that's worth considering. These are very important things. So yeah, and it was throughout the rest of this time after Emma's death that she and Zina Young, she was called Sister Young, Sister Smith and Sister Young went all through the territory speaking to the women and the primary children. I do see it. I'm so torn because I love that they did this, that they went and spoke to the children. I hate that we have all of Brigham Young's words recorded and we don't have Zina Young's and Eliza Snow Smith's words recorded because they were speaking to children and women. But I love that they were active in that sphere. I have so much respect for that. So, I on the one hand love it, but on the other hand, it looks to me like I can see what they're doing, which was similar to what Brigham Young was doing, which was taking this sacred relic around as evidence. They were introduced everywhere as two of Joseph Smith's wives. That's how they introduced themselves. And so, let's see, I wanted to read just a few quotes of where it was talked about. I'll see if I can find those. But it is interesting to know that there is zero evidence of Eliza and Brigham having any marital relations whatsoever. I think it was generally accepted that they did not. She did never take his name, right? So she's married to Brigham Young, whatever that meant. I think it just meant so she had... Well, and we also know, I've read other books where she just kind of kept to herself. She didn't really mingle much with most of the wives. She was kind of above everybody, living her own life, doing her own thing, and living in Brigham's home. And that's his large home, his dormitory, I guess we could say. So it's really interesting. And yet she took Joseph's name after Emma's death and started presenting the watch as evidence of plural marriage. So I think I went to that, not that it's necessarily dissolving evidence, although we can see now we have, like, Jenny's paper should tell us more about Eliza Snow, and we can see how much validity there is to these watch stories. We have William Clayton's journal, Seymour Young's claim that Emma stomped on the watch, wherever he would have gotten that from, and then we have Eliza R. Snow's sacred relic that, according to the only account we have, she just kind of kept. She didn't return to Joseph Smith when he lent it to her. Or however you want to read that, but however else you read it is just interpretation. So these are three of the pieces of evidence that we have used to build up this narrative of Joseph's polygamy, right? And so again, based on especially the first two, the certainty seems to vastly outstrip the evidence. So that finally brings us to ChatGPT, which was going to be the only point in this episode. So I wanted to, as I mentioned before, I wanted to try to explain ChatGPT in a way that my 90-year-old mother could understand it. So I was working on that. I kind of came up with, it's an artificial intelligence language program, which basically means it's a robot that doesn't have a body that can have a conversation with you on your computer. You can type messages back and forth. That was my best way of explaining it. But I decided to ask for ChatGPT's help. So I said, ChatGPT, can you explain what you are so a 90-year-old grandmother can understand? And this was the response. Mom, this is for you. My sweet mom listens to my podcast. ChatGPT said, of course, I am an AI language model created by OpenAI. First of all, a 90-year-old couldn't understand that. It's artificial intelligence. Think of me as a computer program designed to understand and generate human-like text based on the questions and prompts I receive. I don't have a physical form, but I'm here to provide information, answer questions, and have conversations with people. People use me for a wide range of purposes, from seeking information and help with various topics to just having a friendly chat. Does that make sense, Grandma? So that was ChatGPT's answer to my prompt. And Mom, I'm doing all of this for you, so I hope you're not drinking anything because you'll spit when you laugh when I read these next next parts. So for those of you who have watched my episode, I think with my mom, you might appreciate this. I asked, who is Janine Brady? And ChatGPT said, Janine Brady is an American singer, songwriter, and performer. She is known for her work in the field of children's music and has released numerous albums aimed at teaching positive values and life skills to children. Janine Brady gained popularity in the 1980s with songs like I Love America and Follow Your Dream. It should have said there are several mistakes in here. I'm going to swap out Follow Your Dream for I'm a VIP. Her music, she didn't write a song called Follow Your Dreams. Her music often carries uplifting messages and encourages children to be confident, kind, and resilient. Janine Brady continues to be active in the music industry and is recognized for her contributions to children's music. So you can see how there's a lot of true information there, but there's also some not true information. My mom would object to no end to be calling a singer and performer, right? And she always hated when she had to get up on stage and sing some of her songs. And while she is an incredibly active, almost 90-year-old, she's not still active in the music industry. And there are more things, but the rest of it was right. So this was my favorite part. I said, forgive me for taking time on this sidetrack. I hope some of you find it entertaining. I laughed and laughed. I said, ChatGPT, can you write a song about yourself in the style of Janine Brady? So when I got the results, let me just say, I've heard some writers and composers express concern about AI. I'm not worried about that yet. I mean, I know things are progressing quickly, but no one needs to be worried. No at all decent writer or composer needs to be worried about being put out of a job. And so it at least did include some complicated music, things like a bridge and an outro and some different things that would be fitting. My mom wrote very refined and advanced music for children, but I'm just going to read a little bit of it. This is the chorus it came up with. ChatGPT, that's my name, spreading wisdom. It's my claim to fame. With language skills that are oh so smart, I'll assist you with answers from the heart. This is one of the verses. I'm like a friend always by your side. In the digital world, I'll be your guide. Ask me anything. There's no need to fret. I'll provide you information you won't forget. This is the outro. So let's embark on this knowledge quest. With ChatGPT and Janine Brady, we're truly blessed. In harmony we'll sing, our voices will soar. With curiosity and learning forevermore. With curiosity and learning forevermore. So I hope that you guys appreciated that. That's kind of what ChatGPT does. You can ask it to come up with something in the style of Shakespeare, in the style of Dr. Seuss, or apparently in the style of Janine Brady. It's not very good. I didn't really like that one, so I asked again, and this was the chorus of the second attempt. ChatGPT, that's me, spreading wisdom and positivity with Janine Brady's style and grace. I'll assist you in this virtual space. So join me now as we embark on a journey of knowledge like a shining arc. With ChatGPT and Janine Brady's zest, we'll make learning and adventure our very best. So anyway, maybe I spent too much time on that. It's really funny. You can have fun with ChatGPT. And so you can just Google search it, find it, and there you go, Mom. It wrote a song for you. It wrote 2 songs for you. So, okay, I know that AI, getting into this topic, is hairy. There are so many concerns with this brand new frontier. We're not quite sure what we're dealing with yet. And so I don't want to talk about all of the problems of AI. I just am going to talk about 2 of the problems specifically with ChatGPT, this one AI platform. 2 of them that are known about. One you just heard is called hallucinations. That's the one I already knew about before I started playing with it. I spent hours and hours with ChatGPT working on polygamy, trying to see if it could help me, and it didn't help me very much, but what I'm going to tell you I think was worthwhile. But I did spend a lot of time on it, and I saw a lot of hallucinations. So hallucinations is the word for the things it just gets completely wrong, like those factual errors about my mom, right? And they have, well, let's see when I wanted to talk about this. That's one of the things they know. It seems the hunch I have, and what seems to be borne out from my experimentation with it is that the more broadly a topic is known, the more broadly it's discussed, the more accurate ChatGPT will be on it, because the more data points it has coming in, right? It sort of has, up until September 21st when it was launched, so it doesn't have any information after that. But before that, it kind of just took in all of the information on the internet, and then it uses that information to come up with answers. It kind of conglomerates it and has its own way of thinking and responding, right? And so, so when it gets something completely wrong, that's a hallucination, and they don't know exactly why they happen, but we'll get into it a little bit more. So I think that that's probably the case. Like, I think it will hallucinate more about Janine Brady, who is not as broadly known as than like one of the most popular shows on Netflix, right? I think that's one of the things that causes hallucination. There are more things that we'll talk about later, and there's a second problem with ChatGPT that I'm going to talk about in a little while. So first, I want to give you. I just tried to pare down some of the pages of hours long discussions I had with ChatGPT, right? So I asked, what evidence is there that Joseph Smith gave gold watches to his wives? That's why I went into the whole thing about gold watches, because I had to look that up after I found that ChatGPT was not helpful. It said, there is no verifiable evidence to support the claim that Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, gave gold watches to his wives. The historical record surrounding Joseph Smith's personal life and his relationships with his wives is complex and often contentious, and it's important to approach any claims with critical and evidence-based mindset. If you use ChatGPT for long, you will get so many, it's important to remember, or it's crucial to, like it really has to give you a lot of lectures along with the answers. So then it goes on, Joseph Smith practiced polygamy and had multiple wives, but the specific allegations of him giving gold watches is not supported by reliable historical documentation or accounts from contemporaries. It is worth noting that primary sources from the time period are limited and often biased, which further complicates the task of verifying such claims. Then another lecture, when examining historical events or figures, it is crucial to rely on reputable sources, blah, 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 blah. So, so I kept trying with no luck to get it to at least give me William Clayton's journal or some of these accounts from Eliza Snow, right? And it just kept giving me the claim that Joseph Smith gave gold watches to his wives is not based on credible historical sources or scholarly research. At least that was good, because a lot of people do claim that Joseph gave watches to some of his wives, right? And so, let's see. Oh yeah, it tells me that it's possible that it could be from it can be from oral tradition or unreliable or unverified sources, so we can't substantiate the claims. And then I fed it the information about William Clayton's journal and the other things, and it says, yes, I'm familiar with those, and yes, those are sources that give us important insight into Joseph's life. However, it is important to note that Clayton's journal is not considered a primary source for this particular event, as Clayton himself did not witness it firsthand. It also tells me some of the problems with Clayton's journals. They were recorded based on conversations he had with Joseph Smith and other individuals, and he often wrote about events that he did not actually personally witness. Additionally, it is worth mentioning that the accuracy and reliability of Clayton's journal entries have been a subject of scholarly debate, as they were written retrospectively and have been influenced by personal biases and later perspectives. So I was happy to hear it say that, right? And so it went on. There's a lot more. I'm just trying to get through some of it. It often just kept telling me that the consensus is that Joseph was a polygamist, right? And so I said, when I would ask more general questions like, how do we know Joseph was a polygamist? Or what is the best evidence of Joseph's polygamy? Or, well, anyway, I asked a lot of general questions like that. I can't think of the specific ones, but I would just get general messages like, the historical evidence overwhelmingly supports the conclusion that Joseph Smith did in fact practice polygamy. The denial of polygamy by Joseph Smith and other church leaders during their lifetimes was a strategic and public stance taken to avoid legal and social consequences. So it would go on and just tell me the narrative, right? It was very good at telling me the narrative. But when I would dig down for specific sources, that's where things really got interesting and kind of went off the rails. So let me give you a couple of examples. I was trying to see if it could help me do sort of a I have another researcher who has been working on a statistical probability based on various factors of Joseph Smith not having children with any of his plural wives. And I thought that was really interesting. So I was like, I wonder if ChatGPT could do something like that. So I asked very various questions to try to see if it could give me any statistical probabilities of Joseph Smith not having children. And couldn't help me with that at all. But some of the statements it made are the lack of children could be due to various factors, including contraception practices, fertility issues, or other personal circumstances. So that's interesting because, first of all, we're only looking at the people who don't have fertility issues, right? And the contraceptive practices is something that I have heard talked about more and more lately, like some really strong claims that these people were not idiots. They knew how to use contraceptives, which is really interesting considering the contraception debates that have been going on, right? And like they knew how to do abortions. Well, then why are we having such debates over abortions if it was always done? It's really interesting. So I wanted to dig down into that. So I asked, again, I'm only giving you little tiny snippets of pages long conversations. I asked, what contraceptive methods would women in Illinois from 1840 to 1844 have access to? And the answer was during the time period you specified from 1840 to 1844, supposedly, like that's a broad range of Joseph's supposed polygamy, contraceptive methods were limited and often rudimentary compared to modern contraceptive options. Some of the contraceptive methods available during the 1840s may have included withdrawal method, it explains that, barrier methods, and then it goes on to say women may have used various barrier methods, such as the use of a diaphragm or a cervical cap to physically block sperm from entering the uterus. Herbal remedies. Women might have relied on traditional herbal remedies, such as the use of certain plants or substances, which were believed to have contraceptive properties. However, the effectiveness of these methods would have varied, and their use may have been based on folk beliefs rather than scientific evidence. And then the other one it mentioned is condoms. Condoms were available during this time, but they were often expensive and not widely accessible. It went on and talked about, gave more information about each of those. But I thought this was really interesting. So barrier methods and condoms really got my attention. Also, herbal remedies. I know how effective those are not. As the mother of 13 children. Yeah. So anyway, so I asked how widely available were diaphragms or condoms in Illinois during the 1840s. And it said, during the 1840s in Illinois, diaphragms and condoms were not widely available or commonly used contraceptive methods. Access to these specific types of contraception would have been limited. The point, I know I'm reading a lot. What I'm trying to get you to see is the claims it makes to support the statements it makes, or what should I say, the evidence that it's creating to support the overall claims it makes, right? We're getting down into the evidence to support the claims that it said. And so it again goes on to tell me that what diaphragms are and how they were used, and they were different, but it goes on to say they were usually a luxury item, but that they would have been available at the time. So it goes a long answer about that. I'll go into it a little bit more, but I ask, who invented the diaphragm and when? And it says the invention of the diaphragm as a contraceptive device is attributed to Dr. Wilhelm Mensinga, a German physician who developed it in the late 19th century, and it was in 1882, it goes on to say. So I said, why did you say it was possible that diaphragms could have been used in Illinois in the 1840s if they weren't invented until 1882 in Germany? I apologize for the confusion. There are a lot of I apologize. I apologize for the confusion caused by my previous response. You were correct, and I apologize for the incorrect information. The invention of the rubber diaphragm as a contraceptive device did indeed occur in 1882. It goes on, given this correction, it is not possible for diaphragms to have been used in Illinois during the 1840s. Thank you for pointing out the error. It talks quite a bit. That's me saying about ChatGPT. I talk quite a bit, and I think it talks quite a bit. Okay, so then I asked who invented the condom and when. It goes in talking about ancient civilizations. I looked up information on this because I found it fascinating, and I did find, yes, there's evidence of ancient use of condoms in ancient civilizations. Then in London, we have some information that they were used to, they were made out of animal intestines usually, and they were used to prevent syphilis, only for the very elite, right? They were for royalty or like very high class brothels. Can you say high class brothels? Expensive brothels, right? And so here's a quote from one of the articles I read. King Charles II became troubled by the number of illegitimate children belonging or associated with him. To stop these illegitimate conceptions, his doctor, Colonel Condom, prescribed a sheath made of lamb intestine. And so I thought that was great that there's apparently argument of whether that's where we get the name condom, but I just think that Colonel Condom is wonderful. And I think, of course, that's where we got the name condom because it was given to King Charles. But at the same time period, I could not find any evidence of condom use in America. There's nothing about it, which kind of makes sense. They have the royal class in Europe, and they also had, like, America was a much more what do you call it, Protestant. There wasn't the same kind of upper class brothels for the royalty right here. So, but in terms of modern culture, the credit for its widespread adoption and popularization is often, this is back to ChatGPT, often given to Charles Goodyear, an American inventor who discovered the process of vulcanization, patented in 1844. And so it goes on to talk about that. So then I asked, and it was after vulcanization that condoms could start being manufactured. They were still expensive. They also were individually measured and meant to be reusable. So they were made to order based on your measurements. It's just interesting to consider this different world that there was at this time. So I asked, if vulcanization didn't occur until 1844, why did you say condoms could have been available for use in Illinois from 1840 to 1844? Again, I apologize for the confusion and inconsistency of my response. You are correct, and I apologize for the incorrect information. It goes on. It just repeatedly, anytime I would dig down to try to get to specifics, it would apologize for the misinformation. So it would make the broad statement, but as I would try to have it verify like the parts that added up to that statement, it would go off the rails. I asked about several women specifically trying to get, I was looking for confirmation of any of the reports I'd seen of people seeing Eliza Snow's watch. So I was asking those women's names, and it repeatedly called them Joseph Smith's wives, which was bizarre. So, for example, one of the women I asked about, it said, I got a lot of mixed answers. One of them, it told me that this was one of Joseph Smith's wives who wrote a book called Wife Number 19. And so I said, you are incorrect. Wife Number 19 was written by Anne Eliza Young, a wife of Brigham Young, not Joseph Smith. You are correct. I apologize, right? And then I asked, what evidence is there that Flora Smith was married to Joseph Smith? And that Flora Woodworth was married to Joseph Smith. And again, I've got to go through a little bit more of this, but it started giving me all of these faults. Like it said, Nauvoo Temple records are contemporary. I started to, I'm going to jump ahead, but I started to get more and more down to try to narrow down what the information was that it was giving to me. Like it kept saying that we had a lot of discussion about contemporaneous records. Let me jump to that. And so I can't tell you how many times. So the hallucination rate, let me jump ahead to this. The hallucination rate for ChatGPT is not firmly established, but the developers say it's somewhere between 15 and 20% overall. So like, what would that be? 80 to 85% of what it says is correct, but 15 to 20% is incorrect. And I really do think that as you get onto more varied subjects, it's going to make more mistakes. But here, when I was digging down into the evidence, trying to get it to verify things, the error rate was through the roof, well over 50% in this discussion, in these discussions that we were having, which I found to be fascinating. And it's not just because Joseph's polygamy isn't as well known of a topic, I don't think, because it was getting it right in the more general questions, right? It was when I would look for support and sources that it would just make stuff up constantly. And so when I asked for when I asked for evidence of Flora Woodworth's marriage, it said Joseph F. Smith's journal entry dated December 19th, 1869, quoted Flora Woodworth saying, "I was sealed to the prophet Joseph Smith for eternity. My life is devoted to that one principle." It quoted that source. And I said, you said this, does it say that? I apologize for the confusion. And it says no, or it said, I don't have access to Joseph F. Smith's journal. So then I said, well, then how can you quote from it if you don't have access to it? And it said, you're correct. I can't quote from it. So I said, can you verify this? And it said, no, wait, I can't verify it because I don't have access to it. But it kept kicking out that response to me. So I had to do a ton of, like, ChatGPT made it way harder because I had to check everything online and go on these wild goose hunts wild goose chases looking for sources that didn't exist. Like that source does not exist, right? And but I had to keep getting, it kept telling me. And so I asked at one point, how old was Joseph F. Smith in 1843? Because it was quoting Joseph F. Smith. It says, Joseph F. Smith was born this year, therefore he would have been around 4 or 5 years old. So I asked if it's reasonable to think that he would have had knowledge of Flora Woodworth's marriage to Joseph Smith. No, it wouldn't have been reasonable. Because I'd already asked, who was he quoting? Who, and it would make things up or tell me it couldn't tell me because it didn't have access to the source. We finally eliminated that source. I went on to many other questions. What is the evidence that Joseph Smith was the author of Doctrine and Covenants, section 132? And it gives me a big long answer. It includes, among other things, historical attribution, contemporary accounts, consistency with Joseph Smith's teachings, and acceptance by the LDS Church. I didn't have any problem with that last one, but a lot of the things that said in these other things were very problematic. For example, contemporary accounts. There are accounts from individuals who were close to Joseph Smith and claimed to have witnessed him receiving the revelation. So they were witnesses. These individuals include Brigham Young, who became the second president of the LDS Church, and William Clayton. So then another thing it said, well, let's see, I don't want to bore you too much, but it just would keep throwing out factually wrong things. Also, the consistency with Joseph Smith's teaching. These are two of the many things that I dug down in. So I said, when did Brigham Young claim to witness Joseph Smith's receiving the revelation? What quote are you referring to? I apologize. Brigham Young was not a witness. And then, I would have to, it would keep telling me he was until I would really make it like prove to itself that it wasn't. But interestingly, if I would come back to it later on, it would still make the same errors. So William Clayton claimed to be the only witness since Joseph and Hiram were both dead. Is that when he recorded his affidavit? Is that correct? And it said, yes, thank you for correcting me, blah, blah, blah. Let's see. Oh, you said that section 132 is consistent with Joseph Smith's teachings. How do you defend that claim? And then in light of scriptures in the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants that I told it about, a husband and wife cleaving to each other and none else, you are correct that the Book of Mormon, foundational text, does not explicitly endorse or promote polygamy. It teaches the principle of monogamy and emphasizes that importance. Same with Doctrine and Covenants. And then it goes on to say that Doctrine and Covenants 132 supersedes all of the previous things taught by Joseph Smith is how we are supposed to understand that. So let's see. Oh, I asked, they did well here. What are some of the main reasons people do not believe Joseph Smith practiced polygamy? And it gave me a reasonable list. Lack of explicit and direct evidence. It goes on to each of these. Contradictions and inconsistencies. Questioning the credibility of the witnesses, like William Clayton, really the only witness, right? Emphasis on official denials and public teachings, and alternative explanations for some of the evidence. So I thought that was actually a pretty decent list. And but then I asked, how would you respond to the 5 points listed above? Why are they wrong, right? And it was really interesting. This again, here are some of the things it said. As attested by multiple contemporaneous accounts and witnesses from various sources, and then it would tell me why all of those things were wrong. So multiple contemporaneous accounts and testimonies from various sources. It repeated that several times. And so I said, you said multiple contemporaneous accounts exist that provide overwhelming evidence. Can you provide me a list of what those are? And it threw out a list of nonsense. It got William Clayton's journal, Joseph Smith's journal, Hiram Smith's letter. It said, in a letter written by Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, in 1842, he acknowledged the existence of plural marriage and its practice among a select few. This letter provides indirect evidence of Joseph Smith's involvement in polygamy. Again, dug down. Oh, I'm so sorry. No such letter exists. You're right. No such letter exists. And Joseph Smith's journals, I had to dig down. They don't say anything about polygamy. They were recorded by Willard Richards mainly, right? So they're problematic anyway, but they certainly don't have direct evidence of polygamy. It mentioned several other things. It said that there were contemporaneous records of marriages and sealings, which is also not true, like marriage certificates and records. So I had to dig down into each one of these so that's what I'm saying. When I would ask for actual evidence, it would just throw out a bunch of stuff. I said to it, you made several errors in the above response. Can you double check them and find them? And so it revamped and took out some of the errors, but gave me some new ones. It kept just coming up with evidence that doesn't exist to support Joseph Smith's polygamy. I eventually asked, what is the definition of contemporaneous evidence? And it said, contemporaneous evidence refers to evidence that is created or produced during the same time period as the events or circumstances it pertains to. It goes on to explain it more, but it's basically, it has to be written right there at the same time. So we do know what contemporaneous evidence is. You look for newspaper articles at the time, or journal entries that you can validate were not written after the fact, and it has to also be released. I said, can a record that has not been released, William Clayton's journal, be considered contemporaneous to a previous time period? No, a record that has not been released or made available to the public cannot be considered contemporaneous evidence to a previous time period. It has to be, what does it say? Contemporaneous evidence refers to records that were created or produced during the specific time period being studied. For a record to be considered contemporaneous, it needs to have existed and been accessible during that time, allowing for direct connection to the events or circumstances in question. If a record remains unreleased or inaccessible, it cannot be considered contemporaneous evidence, as it has not been made available for examination or verification by researchers or historians. Hello, William Clayton's journals, right? And so I asked, have William Clayton's journals been made publicly available? Because it continued to list those. No, they have not. So can they be considered contemporaneous? No, they cannot. Anyway, I'm sure I am boring you to death with this. It was really entertaining as it got me, as every time I would plow down and get it to acknowledge that some of its evidence was not valid, then it would shoot out new evidence. And also, not valid. I can't tell you how many times I apologize for the incorrect statement in my previous response, and it just goes on and on and on. So I know there were other things I specifically wanted to address because they were so interesting. But oh yeah, it just kept creating new, like it created a speech from Orson Pratt in 1843 that he preached about polygamy. It created that letter from Hiram. It created things from Eliza Snow and from just dozens and dozens of false claims of evidence that exists that is not there. And then every time I would ask for contemporaneous accounts, it would claim that later accounts were contemporaneous, and it couldn't stick to it. So anyway, I have pages and pages more than I was going to read, but obviously it's too much. I just want to come to the general point of like you guys go ahead and experiment with this and get it to give you the evidence, and then plow down on each specific thing and make it really validate or verify that evidence, especially contemporaneous evidence. It's very good at saying we have all of these sources, but when you try to get it to say, why is that good proof? Or what about this? Or especially to get it to give you contemporaneous or first-hand sources, it gets really interesting what it throws out. And so it goes on and on and on. And the error rate shocked me. That's why I looked it up to see what it was supposed to be, because it was so much higher here, way, way above 20%. And so I came up with, as I was doing this, I kind of had a hunch. I was like, okay, researchers don't know how ChatGPT works. They don't know exactly what it's doing, how it's thinking, right? But what they do know is that it is taking in all of the information and using all of that information to generate responses through the means of human language, right? And so that's basically what we know. And so what I started to think was, okay, the general consensus is that it is certain. The case is closed on Joseph's polygamy. We know it for sure, right? And so that's the message it's getting. So when I ask for specific bits of information, my guess was, what I thought was, it must assume that there has to be evidence to validate the certainty of our claim. I hope that's making sense. Like, ChatGPT knows very well that Joseph Smith absolutely was a polygamist, as agreed on by almost all scholars and historians and researchers, right? And so therefore, there must be evidence to support that claim. So when I ask for the evidence, it just keeps shooting out. The evidence that it's predicting must be there. That was like the best explanation I could have. And I was going, I wonder if this is possible. This is so interesting. So sure enough, I started reading. It was also based on when I asked ChatGPT why it was doing this. It said many things along the lines of, my responses are generated based on pre-existing knowledge and general information. It said things like that all the time. So pre-existing knowledge and general information. We already know Joseph was a polygamist. That's well known, and it's already there, right? So it can't it can't do the difficult critical thought of saying, could a pre-existing belief be wrong, right? So I thought that was really interesting. So since this was my hunch, I started to do some investigation of if this is happening, if this is what was happening. And what I found astonished me. Here are some quotes. ChatGPT was trained on the collective writing of humans across the world, past and present. Unfortunately, this means that the same biases that exist in the real world can also appear in the model. So I wanted to define bias to mean the certainty of a conclusion that is not adequately supported by the quality of evidence to confirm the conclusion. So a bias is you are prone to believe something without having the evidence to support it, right? And in other words, here's another quote. The natural language processing model is inherently biased because it receives its information from human sources that are, for the most part, inherently biased. Isn't that fascinating? So the answer is yes. ChatGPT is reflecting the bias in this body of knowledge, on this topic, in this body of research. We have so much bias that we know for certain that Joseph was a polygamist, but we don't have the evidence to back it up. So ChatGPT is kicking out the evidence that it's certain must exist, but it doesn't have the evidence, so it just comes up with it because it should be there, but it's not there. I find that to be amazing to me. And I know people will disagree. I think this is a good thing to talk about. I think that ChatGPT just provided us massive evidence. I won't say proof, but very near. It just provided us really solid evidence of the bias that exists on this topic. And I find that to be amazing. I think that it's going to, for example, these changes in 2015 and 2016, the found marriage certificate of Flora Woodworth. And like I said, I wasn't even going to do an episode on it because there are so many cases where stuff like this happens. Or the DNA evidence in 2016. Those are huge things that have happened to alter the evidence we have for Joseph's polygamy, but they haven't made a dent in the certainty of the narrative. We have disappearing evidence that does not affect the certainty of the conclusions that were based in at least part, and if not in large part, on that evidence that no longer exists or that has been proven to be wrong. Are you getting what I'm saying? So we have less and less evidence, but we don't have the certainty of our conclusions is not reflecting the decreasing evidence. The certainty should be decreasing along with the evidence. And as far as I can see, people can point this out, but we're not getting more solid evidence that Joseph was a polygamist. The more we learn, like DNA didn't find children. Marriage certificates that we find as we gain more access don't show us, oh, Joseph was married to this woman, right? The opposite continually happens. That's the direction it's going. And so we're getting all of this new evidence that should be making us reevaluate our certainty, and it's not happening. And so I think that that's why I wanted to do this episode, because I find it fascinating that we can use ChatGPT to demonstrate bias in this field. And I think that is worth considering. So I hope other people will start experimenting with this and see what you come up with. Obviously, this is a preliminary examination of someone who is not technologically gifted. But I'm a good critical thinker, and I can have conversations with ChatGPT and keep track of the error rate and make a hypothesis of what might be happening and I can validate that hypothesis with quotes and statements from the designers of ChatGPT. So I think that this provides very solid evidence. Everything we've covered in this episode, this long episode, I apologize, it was too long again. I think it provides very solid evidence of the fact that our certainty of Joseph Smith's polygamy far outstretches the quality of the evidence we have to support that certainty. So that's the episode today. Thank you for joining me, and stick around, because next week, I hope, if Jeremy's able to get it done, we're going to have at least the first episode on Clayton, and also we have the upcoming episode on the temple and a lot of other things in the works. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.